Hello, greetings from East Lansing, Michigan. My name is Brendan Cantwell, and I'm professor in the Higher Adult and Lifelong Education program here at Michigan State University. And I'm speaking to introduce you to our webinar on student success at public research universities. This is part of an ongoing project that we have in the Center for Higher and Adult Education here at Michigan State on the project for Public Research University Futures. And for the past several semesters, we've been hosting one or two webinars a semester that take up a particular topic of importance for today in public research universities and for thinking about the medium and long-term future of public research universities. And we invite a series of distinguished speakers who are experts on this particular topic, on whatever particular topic it is, to share with us their expertise. And we ask them to bring one particular question, one burning question that public research university leaders and scholars should be thinking about as they move into the field. And my dog, which was asleep, has all of a sudden decided to bark right now, of course. Um, the project has three parts. We have these public webinars, which have been very engaging and exciting. We also have a series of white papers. So each of our participants produce a white paper that we then publish on our website, and we'll post the link to our website into the chat so that you'll all be able to see it. And then finally, we have an MSU specific part where we gather a group of leaders, not just positional leaders, but faculty leaders, staff leaders from around MSU to convene and have a conversation around the topic that the webinar and the white papers are on, not with any particular agenda, but just as a way to bring community and to have, to foster discussion and proactive thinking about these questions here on our own campus. So I'm very excited about today's webinar. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Ann Austin, who has been co-organizing this series, this program with me, to introduce our panelists and the topic that we're addressing today. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Brendan, and welcome to everyone. We're so glad that you're all here with us today. As we get started, I know, along with Brendan, like to thank our two doctoral student colleagues, Yuning Zhao and Jacob Fortman. They invest a great deal of time helping us with the details of these webinars, and we'll be doing a lot of the background work. And we're very, very grateful to Yuning and Jacob for their really thoughtful work. And of course, we very much appreciate the contribution of ideas and the time from our three speakers, whom I will introduce shortly. But before I move to those introductions, I'd like to provide some introductory framing for our conversation today. We've been doing these webinars now for the last year and a half or so, and Brendan and I like to start with some thoughts about the overall topic before we turn to our colleagues. In the opening comments I'd like to give today, I'd like to give some particular appreciation to Brendan Cantwell and our colleague Chris Wren here at Michigan State. They did a great deal to prepare these background comments, and I'm grateful for that. So a little bit of framing here on student success as it relates to public research universities. I think we would probably agree, many of us, that since the early 2000s, student success has been an animating idea behind a very important, widespread higher education reform movement. If we look back to the early 2000s, we know that at that time, college going was quite high, at an all-time high, I believe in 2010 or 12. With about 7 out of every 10 students enrolling in post-secondary education within a year of their completion of high school. We know, though, that expanded access was not necessarily an unmitigated success. The tuition prices soared, particularly in the wake of the state cuts during the Great Recession period, that borrowing increased considerably, and that lower quality proprietary providers were soaking up demand that was not being fully served or well served in the established campuses. And we know also the completion rates were not at the level we would like. I think most of us would agree that too many of our students have experienced a higher ed system that was actually not designed specifically for their success. Many students have departed from college after a few semesters And often they simply have the large bills, the student loans that they need to pay for those semesters. At the same time, if we look internationally, we know that college enrollments and completions were surging in China and other OECD countries during this time period, and that this pattern has raised concerns within higher education about how we're serving our students and what this means for the U.S., the United States' ability to be economically competitive. So we do know that philanthropic associations, various advocacy groups, state governments, professional associations, and looking back a little bit, the Obama administration did provide some effort to try to reform this area of U.S. higher education by highlighting student success as an important issue for institutional priorities. We want to note as we get started here that the idea of improving equity has certainly been a core tenet of the student success movement. Higher education outcomes, we certainly acknowledge, have been uneven, and students of color, first generation students, low income students, students with disabilities, these groups of students have not necessarily been well served by many of our institutions and our programs. And I think we recognize that as we focus on the issues of student success. With this kind of background, we note that the student success movement has really focused on two prongs, two approaches. One has been to recognize that higher education policies and systems need to be redesigned, and they need to be redesigned in ways that really incentivize centering the experience of all of our students. So that commitment to rethinking, redesigning has been an important thrust. And secondly, programs that recognized and responded to differences in student experiences have been developed to try to eliminate opportunity gaps and to try to ensure more equitable outcomes for all of our students, and particularly for those who have been underserved. Um, this topic has been very much focused on this webinar series has been very much focused on public research universities. We know that a lot of the topics pertain to other institutional types, but we're especially interested in public research universities. And we acknowledge that public research universities have really played an important role in the student success movement. They've been institutions that have been especially interested in advancing student success, possibly because they have often significant resources. They typically have large groups of undergraduates. And one could say also that they've probably been rightly criticized for not being fully equitable in their approach to access. So it's been important. This topic has been important to the public research universities. We note that Arizona State and Georgia State University have been leaders in the public research university arena. They've done work, as have other institutions, to indicate that establishing broadly accessible and high quality programs within our universities can indeed support and help the success of students. We also know that over the last 15 years or so, as this movement has developed, it's coincided with other developments and successes in higher education. We have seen graduation rates go up. Tuition prices have been relatively flat, and borrowing has been ebbing slightly. But while opportunity gaps have narrowed broadly, we do know that the gaps still do endure. And so these are areas that we still must take very seriously and address very carefully. All of us on this webinar today, I think, are well aware that we're experiencing a reactionary backlash against higher education. Certainly that we see that in aspects of the federal government's work right now. We know that the Trump administration has really been quite devoted to prohibiting recognition or consideration of race and gender in efforts to improve student success. We know that the public is more skeptical than it's been in many decades about whether higher education is truly beneficial. And so these concerns about college going and access are very real right now. Nevertheless, despite some of these concerns, the demand for the public research university experience has continued to be strong. And so we do want to look at the experiences that students have and the kinds of success they should be able to expect in these institutions. So we think this is a very good time to take stock, to step back, think a little bit, see where we are with the student success movement, to think about its origins, its present, and where it's going. So we're very honored today. We've invited several experts who have a great deal of experience with this work, especially around student success and more broadly, higher education. And we're very eager to talk with them. We're asking them, as Brendan said, to think about and identify for us what are a few of the really critical questions that leaders in higher education, whether they be faculty leaders, administrative leaders, policy leaders, what should we be asking ourselves and thinking about right now as we consider the student success movement, a movement that has been going on for a while, but one that still is critically important as we consider how higher education can really serve our nation and the world. So I'd like to introduce our three distinguished colleagues who will be talking with us today. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Archie Kubarubia. Dr. Kubarubia is the Vice President for Grants at the ECMC Foundation. And as I'm introducing our guests, our colleagues, Yuning and Jacob, will be inserting into the chat their bios so that you can read a little bit more also. Archie, thank you so much for being with us, and I hope our panelists, as we get going, will not mind if I use their first names, but it's done with great respect for all their leadership. I'd like to introduce Dr. Anne Marie Nunez. Dr. Nunez is at the University of Texas, El Paso, and she serves there as the executive director of the Diana Natalicio Institute for Hispanic Student Success. And she is also a distinguished Centennial Professor of Educational Leadership and Foundations. Anne Marie, thank you so much also for being with us today. And then it's a particular pleasure to be able to introduce my colleague, Brendan's colleague here at Michigan State, Dr. Chris Wren. She not only is serving on this panel today, but has been very helpful as we've envisioned and prepared for this webinar. So we have special thanks for Chris. Dr. Wren is a university distinguished professor of higher adult and lifelong education, and she focuses very much on the student experience and, like our other speakers, is considered a national expert in the area of student success. So we're very grateful to have each of these distinguished colleagues with us. Thank you so much. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask each of our colleagues to highlight for us, present for us the question that they feel we really need to be thinking about right now. And of course, there's many questions, so they've had to think about that and decide what they'd like to highlight for us. They will each of them talk about their question, why it's important, some of the implications, and we'll hear from each of them. And then when we finish that, we'll do what we call a lightning round. I will ask each of the colleagues to take about 2 minutes to just highlight anything that came to their mind as they were listening to the other colleagues, something they want to elevate, something they want to question, or perhaps they have a different point of view about. And then when we finish that, if all goes well, we'll have a little bit of time for questions. And we invite our colleagues who are here with us on the webinar today to put any questions that you'd like to hear addressed in the Q&A, if you would, please. That's where we'll be monitoring, and we'll try to select some of those that seem to be of wide interest. So with that, again, thank you to our panelists, and we'll get started. And we'd like to begin with Dr. Wren. She will get us started. We'll then turn to Dr. Kubarubia, and then we will end with Dr. Nunez. Chris, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Privileged to be with everyone today. I smiled when Anne mentioned a lightning round because those of us in East Lansing had a very long night of lightning rounds last night.
Sure did.
There's quite a bit of storming going on. I'm going to use some slides. They help me organize my mind. One of my former colleagues, Steve Weiland, would say that we had become PowerPointized in our thinking, but yet sometimes it's helpful. So I want to focus a little bit on sort of what is the history of the student success movement? What have we learned from it in terms of successes and failures? Because as Anne noted, it's been going on for quite a while. So that's kind of where I'm heading with my comments for about 12 minutes or less, because they just took the clock away when I shared my screen. So defining student success. I looked through the list of participants while we were doing introductions, and I see friends, old friends and folks I haven't met yet, but from policy settings, state and federal, faculty, researchers around the country, and practitioners in student success. So this is not a new definition to you, I suppose, since you're coming to this. But for a long time, going back into the 1980s and 90s, student success, that term was defined using outcomes of higher education, a lot of them related to learning, verbal, quantitative, subject matter. Did you learn French or calculus or engineering? Critical thinking, so abilities, and then also cognitive, psychosocial, and other kind of identity-based developments. How are people developing as people as well as learning were part of student success outcomes. Of course, student success gets defined quite bluntly as educational attainment sometimes, time to degree, debt on exit, did you complete the credential? And then we look at student success beyond college as career, economic, and quality of life outcomes as well. Within college, or when students are are enrolled, often student success gets measured or evaluated in their grades, their GPAs, good standing, how many credits they're accumulating towards a degree, not just spare credits, and the cumulative debt along the way for students who are taking loans. There are some definitions of student success that look at their engagement and involvement in activities. So it's both a process and an outcome, like how involved are you as a measure of your student success. We also know that how involved are you might promote certain elements of student success. And then a movement towards health and well-being, physical, mental, social, and financial, sort of during college. There's a great branch of research now looking more and more at students' definitions, where people are talking to college students about what do you define as success. One of my own studies, one of my favorite, we ask students every year for 4 years what success meant to them at the same panel of students. And delightfully, one of them learned to swim in her first year. She's like, I took swimming, and that was all I wanted to do when I came to college, was do something new I'd never tried. Another student had found a romantic partner, and they counted that as success. They'd never done that before. These are not in my typical definitions of success. But when I think about what it means to students to be successful while they are college students, I kind of like thinking about that. I'm very proud. This isn't like an infomercial for Michigan State, but our strategic plan adopted a few years ago actually defines student success as the measure of an institution's ability to create environments where all students can learn, thrive, and graduate and have success after college. So that flipping from student success as rooted in the student, but the institution's ability to promote these conditions for not just all students, but some of my colleagues will point out for each student. So that lets us focus on that. So that is another way of thinking about kind of flipping that student success out of the deficit model more into that the way of thinking about student-ready colleges versus college-ready students. So how do we promote student success as an institution? So those are just some definitions. There are additional ones people may want to talk about, and we're happy to take those up later. I want to focus specifically at public research universities. As Anne noted, that's part of the purpose of this series. So academic progress and post-college outcomes are very much the focus of student success work at public research universities. Year-to-year retention, students' GPAs, graduation dates, how long it takes them to graduate, their time to degree, their debt at exit, as we mentioned. And then more and more people are creating rankings and ratings focused on career, earnings, and further education. These definitions of student success at large publics are particularly driven by state metrics, performance-based funding, the rankings and ratings. Oh, rations. Well, there you go. Probably also the rations, but also mostly the ratings is what I meant there. And public policy drives some of the metrics. Sometimes they get framed as efficiency, so student success efficiency or return on investment. I often think about, well, whose investment? State, federal, and student and times. Like, how good is your institution at these time to degree, getting people through, successful results afterwards, economic incomes 10 years down the road? So that's mainly the public research. And of course, it's because of the historical public investment in these universities, but also they educate a whole lot of the percentage of people at four-year institutions. Large public research universities, regional public research universities, they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting, particularly around socioeconomic mobility. So I'm going to talk a tiny bit about, actually a good amount about fleshing out some of what Anne said about the evolution of what I would and others would call the student success movement. sort of what defines this movement. So, as we moved in the United States from elite education to mass education after World War II, we see, of course, participation broadening across race, ethnicity, and sex in the 1970s and 80s. There was this growing awareness that inequitable access was an issue. And so there were these efforts in the 90s and the early 2000s to expand that opportunity. Pathway programs targeted at, for example, Black men, Latino women, Asian American immigrants, but thinking about how did we grow that it was mass access to higher education, but it was not equitable access. And then the realization in the 2000s and early 10s, and of course there were people thinking these ways before that, but the larger consciousness that increased access was not converting to an increase in percentage of college adults with a college degree, nor to equity. So we were at about 41% of US adults with a college degree for a very long time, and other countries started kind of getting ahead of us. So this convergence of economic motivations, what I will call moral motivations, kind of energizes champions for access and success across foundations, as Anne noted, in government and in institutions, kind of at the same time. The 40% of adults held steady for decades. Other nations caught up, moved ahead. The college completion agenda, which was promoted under that term by the Lumina Foundation and Gates, among others. It was pulled into the Obama education priorities, as Anne noted. So this college completion agenda was kind of centered there. I would also argue, and many others do, that non-completion rates can be framed as a moral failing by post-secondary institutions in the sector. We are actively harming individuals who leave our institutions, leave our sector with student debt and no credential, stranding them on the wayside, worse off than if they had maybe not gone to college at all. So there's a moral obligation, I think, as well as this economic motivation and international competitiveness. I did a quick then to now comparison on the cost of not completing. You'll see at the bottom of that slide, there's my AI disclosure. I was like, I think maybe Copilot can help me get these data, but I did check them. So this is Michigan State University's in-state tuition relative to the Michigan median household income in 1975 and in 2000 and in 2025. So what we see here is increasing dollars, but also the percent of tuition as a percent of household income, right? So we see this increasing multi-times over compared to the rate of increasing incomes. And so if you started in 1975 and you didn't complete, you were perhaps had debt, perhaps not, but you were less far behind than you are now. If you go through 2 years at Michigan State University that you're paying out of pocket for, you end up with $30,000 in that you've spent or in debt. That's a much larger percentage of your income. So that, to me, really shows the stakes here that have increased over time. And part of why the student success movement has this moral agenda. Maybe in the 1960s, it was a little more casual of like you started college at maybe an open access Ohio State University, you paid some tuition. If you didn't finish, you were not as far behind as you would be today if you had invested that time and that the financial resources from your family's, 20 to 25% of your family income for that year at Michigan State. So that's something to sort of show that why the student success movement has gained moral imperative over time. So today, the student success movement is what I call a whole industry. It's a thing, right? So there are a bajillion, I think that's the technical term, for-profits, consultants, tech products, a whole lot of ed tech got invested in by a lot of the foundations because they were going to find the one reason students left college and they were going to fix that one reason. That was a thing for a while, like find the solution. There's a whole for-profit industry dedicated to trying to fix higher ed and fix student success, whether it's through student coaching or advising platforms or any number of other ways people are trying to work on that. And that's all before AI jumps into that as well. There are career pathways in student success movement. You can start as a student success coach at almost any public research university these days, with your bachelor's or maybe your master's, and you can work your way up to become the vice president of student success. It's become a career track the way other higher ed career tracks have existed, right? So that's part of this industry as it has matured. Along with that, there has been this network of there are networks. I had the opportunity when I was doing direct student success work at Michigan State from 2013 to 2024 to be involved with the University Innovation Alliance, with Arizona State, Georgia State, and now 19 large public research universities around the country. So there are networks, many of them got funded by the foundations who sort of are, or associations that sort of decided networks are part of the way to move higher ed forward. There's whole conferences, standalone, but within associations. And there's a lot of professional development available around how to do student success work. So it's part of this maturing industry and vocabulary around student success. Basti Torres from Indiana University and I have written about kind of the siloing of student success within institutions and the risk that we have seen, and that is large public, or particularly large, but public research universities often feature decentralization, a lot of silos. And we argued that faculty or instructors, student affairs, academic affairs, and then student success in some places have become its own silo, separate from those other areas, and is drawing resources over there. It's kind of the, I always joke, oh, my provost went to a conference, came back with a new idea for that silo. It's a little cynical, but it's not wildly untrue in my experience. But we also, Basti and I have also looked at how student success can draw theoretical and good ideas from student affairs, academic affairs, and instructors and faculty to create a more integrated sense of student success. And that student success could possibly be an idea that pulls people together across silos, both these functional silos, but also at a large institution, maybe even across academic colleges, for example. So that movement today is in this place of being at risk of a totally separate silo, but maybe also it becomes a place, maybe the current budget situations at a lot of places are causing us to squeeze back away from silos to maybe some more intra-institutional collaboration, maybe. I just want to touch on what I see as the student success futures, as I'm calling them, in public research universities. We do have this economic and moral imperative to get closer to right. We're not going to get it right necessarily, we're going to get closer. Obviously, there are economic outcomes for students, but also to regions and states for people to be successful in college. There is this ethical obligation not to allow the expenditures to end without credentials. That is a bad investment by on anybody's part. We need to make moral good on the promise of access, converting to outcomes that are positive for all. There are structural challenges, but I do believe that most quote unquote solutions have probably been identified. It is not that common, even with AI now, that people are like, I got a new idea to fix the problem. The ongoing challenge we have for the student success movement is how do we scale in context? How do we take a great idea from Iowa State University and try that out at Michigan State in our context? How do we try what's working at the University of Rhode Island and figure out what could work here? What do we look at from what's Eastern Michigan University doing that could benefit us? But we have to take it in context, that the idea that you can just scale ideas and kind of package them and drop them in has been shown over and over to really just not work. And that's, the shiny objectism. I came home from a conference with a great idea. I'm just going to try to copy paste it here. That's not going to work. So I think that is a place where student success movement is right now. How do we scale in context, attending to contextual issues, avoid shiny objectism, but holding fast to our commitments to equitable access with equitable outcomes at a time when there's some push against using those kinds of terms. So that is where I'm going to stop my share and turn over to my very smarter friends who are going to speak after me. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much. This was a really terrific start, and I think you've really kind of bundled together the answer to a couple important questions, such as what does student success mean? What is the student success movement? How has it evolved? And you tucked in some things of, what have we learned that we need to think about as we go forward. So thanks for getting us started in kind of a bundle around a question of what is this movement and how should we understand it? That's a wonderful start. Thank you. I think now we will move to Archie, who will be our second panelist. Archie, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Anne. Thanks so much for the invite to be here. And Chris, thank you for that very fantastic mic drop presentation, because I think it feeds very well into what I'd like to discuss today. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Archie Kubarubia. I serve as Vice President of Grants at ECMC Foundation. We're a national post-secondary funder focused on improving higher education for career success, particularly among underserved populations. Our North Star goal is actually to eliminate gaps in college completion by 2040. So about 14 years is our timeline here. And we want to do that so that underserved learners have greater opportunity for social and economic mobility. I want to build on what Chris mentioned because some of us probably remember our post-secondary experiences from a few decades ago, where we sat in a room and somebody told us, look to your left, look to your right. One of you will not make it to graduation. And that kind of thinking is unfortunately woefully outdated and really risks our economic competitiveness and engaged citizenry. And so building on what Chris said as the moral failing here. So the push for us is to think less about our students college ready, in which higher ed kept pushing the blame to K-12, and more about our institutions ready for for the students that they are enrolling. And so that's what I want to talk about today, where student success really isn't about just completing, but about ensuring that students are better off for having attended our institutions. I love how Chris framed the structural changes that are needed in terms of scaling in the context of our individual institutions. And so the central question I would like to pose for us is, how can public research universities transform themselves into student-ready institutions that deliver and communicate value for multiple stakeholders, not just students, but families, employers, policymakers, and the public? So I'd like to frame maybe two things that are driving this conversation. This notion of a student ready or becoming a student ready institution. So for folks who may not be in the know, AACNU published a book about a decade ago called Becoming Student Ready Colleges by a good friend of mine, Tia McNair. And what this book really pushed for was reframing the student success conversation by shifting the focus from student deficits, as Chris mentioned, into institutional responsibility. And so that flip was very much a big deal because, like I said, for a long time, higher ed had blamed the student for what they were missing from a deficit perspective versus what do institutions have set up in terms of barriers to that success. This reframing is particularly powerful for public research institutions because many of our public research institutions really pride themselves on selectivity, tradition, or what we would call academic rigor. And the book really argues not for lowering standards, but really for aligning institutional practices to how students are navigating college today. And I want to underscore that students are not are no longer your traditional 18 to 22-year-olds. So when we say students, we mean the multitude of factors that come into students, whether they're parenting students, students that have prior learning. And so when we talk about students, I want us to take the focus out of your traditional 18 to 22-year-olds. The second big issue that I'd like to address here is this notion of value and public trust. Chris mentioned the changes, for example, that have happened in the ecosystem as a result of just the movements and a lot of influences, obviously, by philanthropy, but also by government, whether it's state or federal government, in asking questions for institutions that are very much subsidized by public funds and by tuition. The question becomes, is it worth it? And so even as institutions work to improve student success internally, they really have an external challenge here, which is to clearly articulate why post-secondary education and their institution in particular is worth it. And so the Gates Foundation a few years ago launched a post-secondary value commission to start coalescing the field around defining post-secondary value. And I'm less interested in talking about the specifics about how folks define value. As Chris mentioned, it could be something like I went to an institution, I learned how to swim, I met my person, or I got this job, I got prepared. But what we want to talk about is whether, again, students are better off attending your institution versus not attending your institution. So I think for public research universities in particular, this has three implications. The first is that that value must be disaggregated. Um, Aggregate outcomes sometimes obscure who benefits and who does not. And so for institutions to be able to say whether students from different backgrounds experience comparable returns on their investment is an important thing. The second piece is that value must be communicated differently to different audiences. Like I said earlier, students and families are one stakeholder group. They may focus on things like affordability, time to degree, and earnings. Legislators may focus on workforce alignment and regional impact. Faculty may focus on learning, inquiry, civic outcomes. And so one single narrative really is insufficient in articulating that value. And then the third piece is that improving value and communicating value are inseparable. So transparency about our outcomes builds trust, but it also should create some internal urgency for change. So as the public develops tools about documenting the value of our institutions, it's important to be able to know how to take the results of what that value is and explaining it to our various stakeholder groups. So the good news is that we are seeing some institutions that are doing a great job in doing both the transformation work and communicating that value. Prior to being at ECMC Foundation, I was at the Gates Foundation where I oversaw an effort called the Frontier Set. It was an initiative to follow the transformation journey of 29 institutions and two state systems that were either high performing or high potential. And the goal there was really to document what they were doing, to codify what the minimum elements were of institutional transformation that pointed toward value. And there's some lessons that were learned from that particular initiative that I want to share very briefly about. The first is that student-centeredness or student success is and should be a design principle. You can't just add things, as Chris mentioned. I love this notion of shiny objectism. You could buy products, you could do initiatives, but if they are not a design principle for your institution, they are not going to be part of your culture. And really, that's the big piece that we found at the Gates Foundation. When we say transformation, we mean really a change in an institution's structure, culture, and business model. So this is a whole college redesign as opposed to an initiative or this boutique program that's offered at one college or one department. The final piece that we learned around the Frontier Set is that this is about integrating reforms that are already happening. So it's the good news that Chris mentioned is that solution sets already exist. And part of what we learned about scaling is that it's about integrating those solution sets in a way that makes sense for institutions and in the context that they serve. And I love that you mentioned ASU and GSU because they were both part of our Frontier set. And so we developed some codification of the models that they used. GSU in particular, I want to shout out because they developed a model that worked for them that closed gaps in completion. And they are now scaling that model and providing technical assistance to other institutions through their National Institute for Student Success. Another institution that was part of the Frontier Set was Northern Arizona University, who I'm going to shout out. What they did was they built the notion of value into their strategic plan. And so they made a public commitment into demonstrating value and then communicating that value to their students. And so I'd probably end with this notion of student success really as the outcome of intentional institutional design that puts students at the center of an institution's again structure, culture, and business model. This means that everybody's involved in student success. It is everybody's responsibility, from folks in the classroom, for our faculty, for chairs, for deans, to folks outside the classroom, whether you are a student affairs person, you are in residence life, to even folks in facilities, and to folks who are scheduling classes. So the question really is not about whether our students ready for our colleges, but are we as institutions equipped and ready for them?
Archie, thank you so much. That was really terrific also. Just to sort of punctuate a few points that you made, you're framing for us this question of how can public research universities transform themselves, that word transform, um, in ways that deliver value for multiple stakeholders around student success. And I was particularly interested in your comments about purposeful institutional design. I particularly like that because I often in my own work emphasize systemic change, that we can't just change a little of this and a little of that. We have to think systemically. And I really like that phrase, institutional design. And then, as you did, calling out the culture, the structure, and the business model. Thank you very, very much for taking us further in the conversation. We will now turn to Anne Marie, who will, I think, help us think specifically with some institutional examples, also take us further with those. And I want to thank everybody for staying so much on the schedule we were hoping for. I mention that now because colleagues who are listening, I think indeed are going to have time to ask some questions. So if you have a question that you would like to have us discuss, please feel very welcome to put it in the Q&A. We'll be taking a look at those in a little bit, and some of them may relate to each other, and we'll try to highlight some of those for our panelists. So with that, let me turn the podium over to Anne Marie.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Brendan. Thank you to the Center for Higher and Adult Education for hosting this important conversation. I'm grateful to be on this panel with Chris and Archie. My name's Anne Marie Nunez. I am the Executive Director of the Diana Natalicio Institute for Hispanic Student Success at the University of Texas at El Paso. And the Institute broadens research on the effective approaches implemented at broad access institutions, Hispanic serving institutions, and Hispanic serving institutions that are also research institutions, like the University of Texas at El Paso, which is actually the only open access Research One university in the country, as well as a Hispanic serving institution. And so we think that, where we're housed and the kind of research we're doing can help promote student success for all. And so from all of that, the question that I pose, and it's set up so wonderfully by the prior comments, is what can we learn from broad access public research universities about creating cultures of student success? And I want to be clear from the outset that I'm not talking about a single program, a silver bullet, or a checklist of best practices. And instead, I want to focus on something more fundamental, and I would argue more durable. And that's the institutional logics that guide how universities understand their purpose, their students, and their responsibility for student success. So what I'll suggest today, and this is based on 8 years of research, with up to 80 Hispanic serving institutions, including many broad access ones, how these universities can offer critical lessons about how student success becomes embedded in culture, not just layered on top of existing structures. And so why does culture matter? As we've heard from Chris Wren's great setup, over the past 2 decades and more, higher education has invested considerable energy in student success. We've seen new advising models, technological analysis platforms, analytics, completion initiatives, and accountability frameworks. And yet progress remains uneven, especially for students from historically excluded communities. To Archie's point of the importance of disaggregating for whom are these working and who are they not working. So one reason is that many reforms focus on what we do, but not on how institutions make sense of success in the first place. And so this is where the concept of institutional logics becomes important. Institutional logics are the deeply embedded assumptions that tell us what is valued, what counts as excellence, who is responsible for excellence, and whose success matters. And in much of U.S. higher education, particularly at highly selective public research universities, the dominant logics have long been oriented toward prestige, resources, research productivity, and selectivity. And I want to say that these logics are not inherently bad, but they can unintentionally conflict with equity-minded student success efforts, especially at scale. Broad access public research universities often operate under different assumptions that are shaped by their missions, their student populations, and their historical responsibilities to communities. And those differences matter. And so what I'm going to talk today about is 8 years of research in Hispanic serving institutions in one of the most exclusionary disciplines out of them all, computer science. And if you want to know how exclusionary it is, um, fewer than 20% of BA graduates, bachelor's degree recipients in computer science are women, and about 11% are Hispanic. And that's just one example. But I've spent the past 8 years with my research team talking at these institutions with everybody from presidents to provosts to deans to the department chairs of these institutions, to their faculty, to their staff, and to their students to just get a lot of different perspectives. And what I found, what led me to articulating what I'm going to talk about today is feeling like they were operating under different assumptions than a lot of my higher education researchers talked about. And so I'm just going to talk about lesson one. Consider inclusivity as a starting point, not an outcome. So the first lesson is that student success cultures begin with inclusivity as a foundational assumption, not as a downstream goal. And so in the research that we conducted, we consistently heard faculty and administrators articulate a mindset that can be summarized simply. And this is like in the words of one of the leaders. If students meet our admissions criteria, then the question is not, are they college ready, but are we student ready? And so that is a profound shift. And so inclusivity in this context and from these leaders' perspectives doesn't mean lowering standards. Instead, it means rejecting the idea that exclusion is evidence of excellence. And so one leader described their mission as excellence in the service of access, not excellence despite access. And he even said, a lot of people talk about, we'll try to, have both of them as if they're mutually exclusive. This particular leader observed that. So they were talking about these things, but how did it actually show up, right? It showed up in decisions that we observed at the department level, like opening pathways into high demand majors like computer science, rather than using early courses as filters. So offering classes where, that students could take as an on-ramp into the major if they hadn't been exposed to it in high school. Allowing students to begin major coursework while completing developmental requirements elsewhere. One of the departments was not following its institution's policy of not letting students who were still taking developmental courses start their courses in the major, because in the words of one faculty member, if the student shows that they can perform the math in computer science, what does it matter that they're still learning English? And framing teaching assistants as gateways rather than gatekeepers. And one of the things I also want to add, and that I think is very salient for public research universities, at the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine, a lot of places talk about in science the importance of undergraduate research opportunities. And so in these particular settings, I would hear faculty talk about if they have a 2.5 or a 3.0 GPA, but they come to me and they're enthusiastic and I have seen them in class and they're committed, I'm willing to let them work with me on an undergraduate research opportunity. Let's just think about who is really suitable for these undergraduate research opportunities. And so from a cultural standpoint, inclusivity reframes failure. When students struggle, the institution doesn't ask, why aren't they prepared? But what barriers are we responsible for removing? And so for leaders, the key takeaway is that inclusive cultures are built when access and excellence are not treated as opposites, but as mutually reinforcing commitments. And so I'm coming to the second lesson, which is considering talent development as a collective responsibility, which I think we've already heard about. So across these universities, we found a consistent belief that in the words of the person for whom my institute's named, the late president of University of Texas, El Paso, Diana Natalicio, she used to say, talent is widely distributed, but opportunity is not. And so we heard that at these different institutions, right? And so the different stakeholders we spoke with, talked about how students, the unequally resourced K through 12 systems that graduated some of these students shouldn't be confused with their students' potential. And so that particular belief had two important cultural consequences. The first was that student success was framed as a collective responsibility. It wasn't outsourced to advising units or student affairs offices. Chris's comment about siloization was particularly striking to me, actually, because faculty saw mentoring, teaching, and opening professional pathways as integral to their roles, even when those responsibilities exceeded what might traditionally be defined as the job. I won't forget a faculty member saying, with some of the things that he was taking responsibility for, they didn't teach us this in graduate school, right? Second, talent development extended beyond students to include faculty and staff. Staff actually had, many of them were attending faculty meetings. There were line items on the faculty. We were observing, I didn't even mention, we observed a lot of classes, professional clubs at these institutions. And a lot of times we saw staff bringing student concerns to the faculty. And so leaders emphasize that if educators and faculty don't feel valued, supported, developed, they can't create environments where students can thrive. And so from a leadership perspective, this shifts the conversation from, interventions, which we've already talked about, silver bullets, to capacity building, which raises questions like, how do we structure rewards so that developing students' potential is valued? And one of the things I think about with regard to public research universities in particular, right, when we're thinking about, again, coming back to undergraduate research opportunities, those are excellent chances to blend research and teaching. How can we, think about how those opportunities are made accessible? How do we invest in professional learning that aligns faculty identities with student success goals? And how do we recognize the long-term societal impact of educating students who may otherwise be excluded from opportunity? And so these universities can remind us that scale is not an obstacle to care, but it does require intentional structures that support it. And finally, the lesson 3, cultural and community responsiveness as essential to building the academic infrastructure. And so the way that I'm thinking about the design principle concept that Archie brought up, right? That a lot of the faculty staff that we spoke with talked about viewing bilingualism and cultural navigation as assets rather than deficits, designing pedagogy that recognized students' work, caregiving, and financial responsibilities, and then supporting students in translating academic opportunities. So internships, research conferences to families that might have been unfamiliar with higher education norms, that, maybe explaining to families about what it would mean if a student was going to a research conference, right? Or going away for an internship. I will add too that, right after the pandemic, these institutions were really quick. A lot of them were getting, and not a lot of them, I mean, some of them went in together National Science Foundation Rapid Grant, to be able to offer online research opportunities and internships really quickly to their students. And so a really interesting outcome of that is recognizing that making some of these opportunities available online made them more accessible to some of the students who felt like they couldn't go away, right? So just to kind of pull it all together, when we think about it, the logics prioritize inclusivity over exclusion, talent development over sorting, and cultural responsiveness and community responsiveness over neutrality, and not forgetting about the context within which these students are operating in their own communities. And so everything I'm talking about, these aren't anti-research logics, and they're not anti-excellence, but they are asking us to rethink how excellence is defined and for whom it is produced. And so these align with some of the broader shifts that we're seeing nationally, but I think we'll have more of a chance to talk about that. And so I'm just going to close with a leadership question rather than a prescription. And so if student success is truly central to missions of these institutions, then we must ask, what institutional logics are we reinforcing every day through our policies, rewards, our narratives, our resource decisions? And do they align with the students, families, and communities that we serve? And so when we look at institutions like this, it kind of can inspire us to think that building cultures of student success is not about doing more, but thinking differently about responsibility, potential, and purpose. Thank you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Well, Anne Marie, thank you so much. What a wonderful flow. And I love the way you built on the remarks from Chris and then from Archie about purposeful design. And I think you really were helping us think about this question of number one, what can we learn from these broader access institutions? And then related to that, how should we think about institutional logics? As a way to help frame the institutional purposeful design to actually serve students. I also really appreciated your emphasis on culture and sort of broad involvement and your particular comments about staff and how important staff as well as faculty are, and the notion of aligning our cultures in support of the school. So thank you, Anne Marie, and thanks to each of our panelists for such very thoughtful comments and comments that really built on each other, which leads us to this part of our time together, which is what we call our lightning round opportunity. I know each of you have had occasion to probably intersect and work together over the years, but certainly in this hour to hear each other. And we wanted to give you each a short moment, about 2 minutes each, to just elevate something that may have come to mind as you were listening to your colleagues. I'm sure you have lots on your mind, but if you could choose an idea that you'd like to bring forward now, we will do that. And again, to those who have joined us today, this would be a great time for you to be thinking about any questions you'd like to have explored further. And we invite you to put the questions on your minds into our Q&A, because we'll be turning in a few minutes to questions from the community that's gathered here. But first, our lightning opportunity. And as Chris said, it's very relevant to us in the Midwest because we have had a great deal of lightning lately in the last 24 hours and apparently expect some more coming up in the next 24. Would any of you like to get started? Anybody have just burning to jump in? But if not, I'll go to Chris and ask. Maybe I'll go in the same order if you don't mind. But if anybody is eager to start, if not, Chris, why don't you get us started?
I did see Archie unmute before.
Oh, did you, Archie? Well, we would love to have you
Oh,
jump
yeah,
in.
no,
Thank you.
I'm happy to. Okay. I wanted to reflect on two things. Anne Marie, I love the framing around institutional logics, and I think that this gets at the heart of the conversation. We might use different terms, whether it's transformation or reform, but we're talking about the DNA of the institution, right? Which is a very interesting way to get out of the shiny objectism that Chris was mentioning. Um, and so it can be very daunting, but this notion of looking under the hood of our institutions and identifying not just the low-hanging fruit, but really what's running, what's the engine underneath, and does that engine need to be refreshed? Does that engine need, I'm not good at automobile, auto metaphors. So, but whatever you need to do to an engine to get it to run better and do its thing, is the thing that I think we're talking about here. And then Chris, I loved, what you mentioned about, Michigan State's definition here of student success. And I think that's what we're finding more is when institutions start taking accountability and responsibility for the success of their students, it does get to that moral piece, that if you admit them, shouldn't you be doing everything you can to ensure that they walk across that stage, however long it takes them to do so?
Archie, thanks for getting us started. That's terrific. Chris, we'll jump over to you and give Anne Marie just another moment to catch her breath.
Thanks, and thanks, Archie, for pulling that forward. Lots of things kind of come in all of them. The obviously the engine refurbishment or whatever that is, Archie. I'm with you on that. I was really thinking, and I think I mentioned this to Emery. I'm teaching a class with Michigan State University's president this semester, Dr. Kevin Guskowitz, and we are teaching a class to doctoral students around the university who have aspirations toward academic professions. And one of the students in the class is a graduate of UT El Paso and had the opportunity to meet and work with Dr. Natalicio, not in the academic department. And that student is very clear that her aspirations are to become a professor and do exactly what Dr. Natalicio did for many other people. And so I think about that, and I think about one of the assets that research universities have, and there's a question in the comments about applying these ideas to graduate education, which we can get to. One of the assets we have, a critique and an asset, is that tens of thousands of credit hours are taught to undergraduates by graduate students at public research universities. So a lot of our students, like the ones that are in the class that I'm teaching with President Guskowitz, they're teaching large sections, right? And I think about this, you're coming from anywhere in the United States or around the world to get a PhD in whatever you're coming to a place like Michigan State or UTEP. And you are probably the top of your class, right? Like you're one of the best special education researchers or nuclear physics or whatever that area is, because that's why you come to get a PhD in it. If you can come to one of our research universities anywhere in the United States, a public research university, and part of what we can help you think about is student success, because you're going to go out and most of you are not going what we would say up the line. Like most students are not going to end up teaching at a more elite institution than the one they attend, right, for their PhD. Like, can we send our doctoral students out to become instructors who think about student success and who get to their next institution and say, where's our Diana Natalicio Center? Where is our resources? How do I point students towards getting the help they need? Because probably they're teaching intro sections, maybe of students who aren't as good at that thing as they were, right? So I have this vision that public research universities are not only training doc students to be researchers, but a lot of them are also being funded by teaching assistantships, right? Or at least partially. So how do we think about leveraging that resource? And it's why when I talk faculty, but I also talk just instructors, because of the high percentage of undergraduate instruction that's done not by tenure stream faculty, right? So I'd like to sort of build on that idea of like, what if we could bake into the system of graduate education, sort of thinking about, Archie's point about how do we reform some of the DNA? Like, what if we rethink graduate education a little bit to be sending out, people who will proselytize on their new campus for student success and ask those questions like, what do we do here? Like, how do we support them? So that's part of kind of putting together, but also through the thread of Dr. Natalicio herself. I will stop.
Chris, thanks so much. And I think in a moment we are going to want to talk a little bit about graduate education because I know there's a question pertaining to that in our chat. Anne Marie, let's hear what your lightning thought might be.
I think that just, Chris's point that that Archie reiterated that a lot of this idea that a lot of solutions have already been identified. And I think the importance of better understanding the implementation of those ideas. Keegan and Leahy in their work about why institutions don't change, just talk about the really simple point that both attitudes and behaviors are required to shift institutions. And so, how is it that we're talking about implementation? And I'm grateful. I think one of the things I should say about the research that I just talked about is that these computer science departments were willing to let us look under the hood, in Archie's words. And not every place is willing to do that. And I think, so one of the things in other settings I talk about is that a talent development mindset is not just assuming that students can learn, it's assuming that faculty and staff also take responsibility for learning. So when I was interviewing faculty, one of the, how when anybody here who's done qualitative research, your last question might be, is there something I should have asked you about? And a lot of times these faculty and administrators, actually, one of the administrators put me on the spot. He said, what are we doing wrong? So that a lot, or they would say, what can we do better, Anne Marie? And I felt like they were asking me to give my preliminary findings right in the middle of my study. But I think it was an indicator that they also saw themselves as constantly needing to learn how to better serve their students. And so just thinking about what is it under the hood every day that contributes to implementation of these initiatives when, as has been said, there's a lot of solutions and shiny objects out there.
Wonderful. All three of you are so inspiring to listen to. I suspect many of us on the call feel that we've been energized just by being in your presence for the last hour. So thanks so much. And we do very nicely have a good block of time for some conversation together. And there's some interesting questions that have emerged, and I have one or two if we ultimately have time to get to them. But we'll save the graduate student question for a moment. One interesting question I think that's arisen in the chat has to do with the fact that many institutions are very interested in evaluation, and we have evaluation offices, and that's not always the same area of as the people who are working on student success. And there are probably, I think there are also states that are especially interested in sort of evidence in particular kinds of ways of achievement. So, could you comment on what you see as the relationships between evaluation processes and evaluation priorities that institutions may have, outcome priorities that are measured in terms of certain learning outcomes? How does that all work with the kind of what I would consider to be holistic look at student success that I've heard? Now, you may want to rephrase the words that I've used, but what is your sense of the relationship between evaluation and student success? Would one of you like to get us started on that?
I can maybe speak to that a little bit. I think with evaluation, one of the things I'm thinking about is the role of the institutional research office and how I think public research universities are very well suited, should they choose, to engage their institutional research offices in disaggregating data and tracking persistence and completion. And that's something that Diana Natalicia, when she was president, was really involved in, to the point where she worked closely with the people in the institutional research office to track data on student performance. I do think Georgia State University, which has been referenced here already, also does a really good job with that. And so I think with regard to evaluation, if there, and by part of the reason I'm saying public research universities in particular, right, is I work with all kinds of universities, and there are not very well resourced HSIs that don't even have a full-time IR person. But public research universities don't have that excuse. So I think, perhaps having institutional researchers who are leaders and can think really creatively, at the very least, about disaggregating metrics, but also how do we develop constructs of student success that are more expansive in the ways that I think Chris's presentation really teed us up to think about.
Thanks, Anne Marie.
So I'm a recovering IR professional, and so absolutely, please leverage your institutional research officers. And I do want to underscore here that I think the unique role that public research institutions have in creating knowledge, not just for themselves, but also for the field in how to do this well. And so I think I would leverage that. The other piece I'd probably mention is the good news is that a lot of accrediting agencies have already baked in student success into their standards. And so it's showing up somewhere already at your institutions. And if it's not it's being surfaced, it's a matter of pulling those threads together.
Thanks very much, Archie. Chris, would you like to add anything on this one? Archie, I wanted to pick up on what you were just saying about the accrediting agencies. I was just attending about 2 weekends ago, I guess it was, the HLC, the Higher Learning Commission meeting, which was, if I remember correctly, that one was in Chicago. And I thought student success was very much woven into the discussions there. So I think your comments about leveraging the IR offices make a lot of sense to me, and I think it's being talked about. And it seems to me that kind of leveraging it seems to be an example of the get everybody on board idea that I heard several of you talking about also. Thank you for your thoughts on that. So let's turn to graduate students. One of our questions observed that while the interest in student success, and we've documented this in our conversation, has really grown over the last 2 decades or so, or almost 2 decades, that it's not entirely clear where graduate students fit in that conversation. I wondered if any of you could comment on that. Should we be thinking about graduate students with some of the same perspectives you've described? And if so, what might that look like? And Chris gave us some ideas before of how we can prepare our graduate students to make contributions as they perhaps in their careers join institutions that are committed to student success. But what does this mean for their own success as graduate students? Would any of you like to comment on the student success movement as it relate to graduate education? Chris?
I'll get us started. I mean, obviously, yes, I did talk earlier about how they can contribute to it, but I think that the trickle up of some, there are some, once you figure out something, maybe whether it's basic needs or mental health services or childcare for your undergraduate students who are parents, like these things translate up pretty smoothly. I think there's some kind of obvious kind of wraparound kind of things. I do feel like there's this generational shift we're seeing. The Many graduate students, particularly those who go straight through from an undergrad, are accustomed to a certain kind of more holistic treatment potentially. Maybe post-COVID, there were some expectations that I think students have around support and those things. I think it's also, there are some generational shifts. And then I think also looking really carefully, so many graduate professional students, medical law, all across are adult learners. And I feel like a place that will really have that connection. I'm thinking about the connection to faculty and staff, particularly staff, thinking about particularly the other kinds of caretaking roles that are adult learners as undergrads, but very much as grad students have, right? Like these are people who are doing family caretaking, all kinds of other like family situations. And I feel like that's, I don't hear a lot of conversations about that outside of sort of individual departmental kinds of ideas people talk about, like, here's what we're doing. So I do feel like, particularly think I worked in student affairs before becoming faculty and thinking about, what we know in student affairs, which often is segmented, undergrad, grad, like what we could be learning in our grad schools that are thinking about holistic grad school wellness and success, like really connecting to some of the good work that's happening in thinking about undergrad. So I feel like, again, not copy paste, but like scaling within could be helpful. And that lets us connect to local resources as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Chris. Anne Marie or Archie, did you want to offer a thought on this question?
I think part of what I'm also taking away from what Chris is saying, right, is that a lot of the student success literature, right, has focused on undergraduates. And so what is it that can be learned from the undergraduate student success that can be adapted to graduate students, but also what is more contextually specific to graduate students, right? And I think from my own research, and partly because Hispanic serving institutions are designated on their undergraduate population. We were asking mostly about undergraduates, but we also found the importance of what we called multidimensional student support structures that look at academic, financial, social, cultural, and career. And so to just think about the range of different supports that graduate students might need. I mean, if we admit them, making sure that their financial packages, right, that we're thinking about how are they going to be supported, but also perhaps for careers, maybe for some of them, a faculty career is not appropriate, right? So, and I don't mean appropriate like they're not skilled. I mean, they may want to, take their own pathway. And so how are we supporting them in a way that meets their own pathways? Or if we're thinking about cultural and community responsiveness, right? Like some of my graduate students, I'm smiling because I had one who came to me and said that the university wasn't spelling his name correctly, his ethnic name correctly, or they weren't going to say it properly. And I felt like he could only share that with me because of my background and my last name. But how are we fully listening to graduate students and affirming their belonging in these different ways from these different angles, I think is important. And that's just all to say, I think there are less lessons we can learn from our studies on undergraduate education, but adaptations we can make according to graduate student contexts.
Great. Thanks for those thoughtful comments.
I might add something to just, make the conversation a little exciting. If I might say something a little impolitic here. Speaking of looking under the hood and just looking at the DNA, I think we ought to look at our graduate programs and what value we're providing to the field and to our students from those graduate programs. Particularly since we know that a lot of students also borrow for graduate programs. And so again, if we admit them to these programs, what commitments are we making to ensure that they complete? Otherwise, they don't complete and are saddled with debt as well. And so thinking about how we structure our graduate programs and what resources are available, I think is super critical.
Thanks very much. These are really thoughtful comments, very helpful. I want to turn to a topic that is on all of our minds much of the time, and that is the very politically charged environment that we're in, and the recognition that some of people are working in states that have some particular bans on language and on curriculum and on DEI programs. Could you each reflect on how to do the work that we're talking about? How do we address student success in the context that we're in nationally, but also the particularities? And I know some of you have some particular experience in states that may have contexts that are particularly challenging for this work. And I think the question also that was put into the chat asked us to think, especially as we're considering student success and opportunity gaps, to think especially about students of color. And how do we do this work that serves students who identify in particular groups? How do we do the work, though, when we're in a very politically charged environment? Might each of you comment on your thoughts about that or your experiences in doing this work at this moment in time? Anyone want to? Anne Marie, I'm going to ask you if you would get started. I mean, clearly you are in a particular state that many of us know has some challenges for the kind of work that you're engaged in.
I think that framing the work that we do in terms of student success is essential for institutional effectiveness, and that is a message that all leaders, whatever state they're in, or all legislators can hear, right? Everybody has an interest in expanding economic and social opportunities for their regions. And that requires that all students succeed and that it should be a measure of institutional effectiveness. So if we can even look at disaggregated data, which is being required sometimes, actually, the current administration is requiring that certain institutions provide disaggregated data on admissions, right? It's important to continue to look at who is succeeding and who it is not, and making sure that all students are succeeding. And I think framing that in terms of institutional effectiveness, broadening opportunities for our states is really critical right now.
Thank you very much.
And I actually want to also, I do want to also add something very quickly too. As many of you know, and as I just described, I work in a Hispanic serving institution, and Hispanic serving institutions, their funding is under, threat right now. And Archie talked about the importance of highlighting certain narratives. And one of the things that we're finding out about HSIs in our analyses of the new Carnegie Access and Earnings classifications that focus on economic mobility. So that's a new classification system that elevates economic mobility of these institutions for all institutions. And HSIs, at four-year HSIs are 3 times as likely as non-HSIs to be what they call offering highest access and highest earnings. And so I think when we can think about how our institutions are promoting success for all students, that's really important. And by the way, that's for all, in other words, those are the earnings of all students that are measured, right? Not just Hispanic students.
Thank you very much.
I would I'd plus one the framing part of it, because certainly while we're experiencing a particular kind of context, there have been other contexts over the last 2 decades that have required institutions that, again, who can articulate their value in a particular way to different stakeholder groups, uh, have been more successful than others. I think that's part of why the push towards being able to quantify or qualify the value you provide and then articulating and practicing articulating it to different stakeholder groups helps a lot because the contexts will shift. And so
Mhm.
whether it's employers, whether it's state legislators, whether it's parents and families who are choosing with their tuition dollars to go somewhere else, right? So being able to reframe that, I think, will be helpful here.
Mm. Thank you very much. Chris, anything further you'd like to add right now
Um,
to that question?
I have the opportunity until the next general election to work in a state that is to work in an institution that engage in what I would call anticipatory overcompliance with some of these issues. So we are sort of get to see what's happening in other states ahead of us and look with dread at some of that and thinking maybe it gives us time, and I'm previewing the next question, which touches on shared governance, although maybe not the focus of the question, and thinking about what can faculty institutions do to be thinking ahead about not how to hide what we're doing, just retitle it, but how to really fundamentally say, if equity and access are central to our DNA and in our mission, how do we build that in so it's kind of legislature proof, if one will? So I think that's an opportunity that I don't know that we are taking advantage of, but I think it's something we should be paying attention to. Those of us who have the privilege to have a little more time.
Thank you very much. I'd like to also ask, and let me just preview something. We have a few more minutes, so we'll ask a question or two further, and then I think we might have time for each of you to give a final thought if you'd like to. So I just wanted to prepare you for that and not surprise you in 3 or 4 minutes. I'd wonder if you could each comment on the research that supports the work that we're talking about. And of course, Anne Marie, I know you were directly speaking from research, but my question is, what kind of research is needed to support the student success movement at the moment in time where we are now? That is, the movement's been going on for a while. We've already learned a lot, and you've discussed that. But what kind of research do we need now going forward?
I could maybe
Chris?
get us rolling. I, there is continuing research and R&D related to the quote solutions. That's important. Incorporating AI in those, very important. I do think the focus though is really much more on what we've talked about with Emery and Archie talked about. Like it's on that taking what we already know and transforming organizations, institutions to do it. Like how do we do it? And Anne, you yourself have a very substantial research agenda in how to transform undergraduate STEM education and working with grad students and faculty. Like, I think that learning some lessons maybe from outside this quote unquote student success movement, like looking to like, what do we already know about how networks work and how change happens? Like, I think that's, I think a strong focus. Like, how do we shift our institutional logics, for example? That research, I think, is the next wave here.
Thank you very much. Archie?
Yeah, so +1 on implementation fidelity, and I use the word fidelity. However, those solutions need to show up. I think the other piece is around the integration of things, right? So very rarely do we see one particular student need, for example. We see it as intersectional. And so I think there's opportunity to see how all of these solutions come together for students who present very intersectional challenges or opportunities. And so I think we haven't quite cracked the code on that yet.
Really interesting. Thank you. And Anne Marie.
So, I was at the American Educational Research Association for this past week, and I had the honor of hosting a session with the National Science Foundation director of the STEM Education Directorate, James Moore. And one of the things he talked about, so I just want to +1 doing research on implementation, application, understanding the context and conditions under which these efforts work. He also just talked about the importance of translation. And I think that that's interrelated with these others. So for example, right, in the research that I do with I do a lot of research with computer scientists and geologists. And I think understanding how those disciplinary contexts work, right? Or it could be understanding what is the role of a provost and trying to be able to translate the lessons we're learning in a way that is applicable to their goals, because they don't have time to go and read all of our research. And sometimes that's not their discipline. And so if we can try to make the lessons that we learn accessible and translate them to the different audiences that we're working with, including faculty and graduate students in particular disciplines, I think that would be pretty powerful.
Excellent. This is really helpful. This gives us, those of us who are researchers listening to this, as well as institutional leaders, some good ideas to think about. Knowing that undoubtedly there are questions that we haven't been able to get to, it's actually not bad to leave us hoping for the next conversation, whether it be here in a webinar or at conferences or in the literature. But knowing the questions remain, we are going to have to wrap up in just a moment. And I'd like to invite each of you just to take a short moment to end us with a thought that you'd like us to take away with us, something you want to highlight, or perhaps you didn't get to say already, whatever you would like to. Archie, could I ask you to start this one?
Yeah, no, I'm envisioning a world where let's say a student attends their first year orientation and the person at the front says, look to your left, look to your right. We have made sure that you will make it to graduation, and what that would look like.
Thank you so much. Your comment earlier was bringing back memories from when I started college, and I love the sentiment that you've given us now. Thank you so much. Anne Marie? Oh, your mic went off, if you wouldn't mind turning.
Sorry about that. To build on that idea, I think I can envision a world where, incoming staff and incoming faculty have tools to understand how to promote student success in a way that doesn't feel like an add-on or an additional burden for them, given all that they have to do, but in a way that they can integrate these tools with their responsibilities to serve and support students.
I love it. Thank you so much. And Chris?
I'm taking some inspiration from Anne Marie's background. I do, in spite of all that is happening, I still believe in the power and potential of higher education, and particularly public higher education, to literally transform lives. I know it's a little rainbowy, but I really do believe in that. I believe these kinds of conversations are part of what help us get there. And I really do think that we are on a path and a journey to do that. So I'm here for it.
Well, I just want to thank each of you so much. This conversation about student success has informed us. We go away with some of the history. We understand what's evolved. We understand what some of the possibilities are going forward. I've especially loved the emphasis on what I would call systemic change, purposeful design, and bringing together, each of you spoke about bringing together all of the stakeholders, the members of our institutional communities in support of student success and ways that we can do that. And you've all spoken, I think, from a point of not only commitment, but of hope and vision for the future. And that's extremely uplifting and also very practical as we move forward. So we want to conclude today, first of all, with immense thanks for the time, not only that each of you have spent with us today, but for your careers that have invested so much time in support of our students and helping the rest of us learn how to more fully support our students. So deep thanks to each of you for those really immense contributions that you have and you are making and will be making. And also thank you to all our colleagues who have been with us this afternoon. We know you're thinking deeply and working with such commitment in this area too, and we really appreciate that. As we do our final remarks here, I know my colleague Brendan and I would like to invite you to stay connected with our Center for Higher and Adult Education and with this particular series on the futures of public research universities. We do anticipate in the fall that we'll have some further conversations, and we will be in contact with you via our mailing list to let you know about those. If there are striking topics that you hope will be taken up, we would welcome your communication with us. But we do look forward to continuing the conversations on important topics as we move further into the year. So we wish everyone who is here much success if you're in a situation of concluding the academic year. I want to just quickly turn to my colleague Brendan and ask if I'm forgetting anything that we should be mentioning now.
No, just thanks everybody for their time, their insights and expertise, and glad that we had a great community of folks to gather around this important topic. That's all.
And again, thank you to Yuning and Jacob, who were very much helping us behind the scenes. That's help that we absolutely need and appreciate. Happy spring to everyone who's here, and I know we're all enriched by the conversation today. Anne Marie, Archie, and Chris, thank you very, very much. Goodbye, everybody.